The heart of Germany's Harz Mountains, beneath thousands of tons of ancient rock, lies one of World War II's most ambitious and disturbing engineering projects. This is not a story of heroism or glory, but of desperation, innovation, and the darkest depths of human cruelty. It is the story of how Nazi Germany attempted to build an invisible empire, underground a subterranean world where the future of warfare was being forged in chambers that sunlight. Strategic nightmare of 1943. By the summer of 1943, the tide of World War II had turned decisively against Nazi Germany. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of European skies, was being systematically destroyed. British and American bombers darkened German cities day and night, reducing industrial centers to rubble. The proud factories that had once churned out tanks, aircraft, and weapons now lay in ruins, their machinery twisted into scrap metal, their workers scattered or dead. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, faced an impossible task. Germany's war machine was grinding to a halt, not from lack of designs or ambition, but from lack of production capacity. Every factory built above ground became a target. Every assembly line was vulnerable. In the Führer's bunker, desperate discussions took place. Hitler, increasingly detached from reality, still demanded miracle weapons, the Wunderwaffen that would turn the war around. Chief among these was the V2 rocket, a technological marvel designed by Wernher von Braun and his team at Peenemünde. This was the world's first long-range ballistic missile, capable of striking London from launch sites in occupied Europe. But there was a critical problem. The V2 production facility at Peenemünde, located on Germany's Baltic coast, was devastatingly bombed by the Royal Air Force in August 1943. Operation Hydra, as the raid was codenamed, killed hundreds of workers and scientists, destroyed vital equipment. The message was clear. Any above-ground facility, no matter how important, could be destroyed. Germany needed production centers that were invulnerable to bombs, invisible to reconnaissance aircraft, and capable of operating regardless of what happened on the surface. The solution was as audacious as it was terrifying. Go underground, not just a few meters down, but deep into the earth where no bomb could reach. Build entire cities beneath mountains, complete with factories, storage facilities, dormitories, and rail lines. Create a shadow empire that existed beneath the world. Behind the plan, Hans Kammler was not a name known to most Germans during the war, but within the SS, he was a rising star. An engineer by training, Kammler had distinguished himself in the construction of concentration camps, designing the crematoria and gas chambers that would facilitate the Holocaust. His reward was control over increasingly important projects, including the underground construction program. Kammler was a true believer in Nazi ideology, ruthlessly efficient and utterly indifferent to human suffering. He saw slave labor not as human beings, but as renewable resources to be consumed in service of the Reich. Under his direction, the underground construction program would become one of the largest engineering projects of the war and covering the perfect mountain. The Kohnstein mountain, near the town of Nordhausen in central Germany, had a secret. Since the 1930s, its interior had been hollowed out to create storage facilities for strategic petroleum reserves. Two parallel tunnels, each about a mile long, ran through the mountain like enormous horizontal shafts. Between them, 46 cross tunnels connected the main galleries, creating a vast underground labyrinth. For the Nazi planners, it was perfect. The mountain itself provided protection equivalent to hundreds of feet of reinforced concrete. The existing tunnels meant construction could begin immediately, and the location in central Germany, far from the front lines but accessible by rail, was ideal for a production facility. The project received a codename, Mittelwerk, or Central Works. Its mission to produce V2 rockets and other weapons and nearing the impossible. The transformation of the Kohnstein into a functional weapons factory was an engineering challenge of staggering complexity. The existing tunnels were just the beginning. They needed to be expanded, reinforced, and equipped with everything necessary to produce the most advanced weapons in the world. Massive excavation began. The tunnels were widened and heightened. The rough rock walls were smoothed and, in critical areas, lined with concrete. Railway tracks were laid throughout the complex, creating an underground transportation network. Electrical systems were installed, thousands of lights to illuminate the perpetual darkness, power lines to run machinery, ventilation systems to tunnels, designated Tunnel A and Tunnel B, became the primary production halls. Each was large enough to accommodate entire assembly lines. The cross tunnels were converted into specialized workshops, storage areas, and administrative spaces. At the complex's peak, it contained over 1 million square feet of usable space. But machinery alone doesn't build rockets. That requires workers, thousands of them. And finding willing workers in 1943 Germany was impossible. The solution, in keeping with Nazi ideology, was to use slaves. The arrival of the damned. In August 1943, the first prisoners arrived at Mittelwerk. They came from the Buchenwald concentration camp, transported in cattle cars and marched down into the mountain. Most were political prisoners, resistance fighters from occupied territories, Soviet prisoners of war, and Jews who had... What they found underground was a vision of hell. The tunnels were still under construction. Rock dust filled the air, coating everything in a fine gray powder that turned to mud when mixed with water and sweat. The ventilation systems were incomplete, making the air thick and suffocating. The temperature was constant around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, which sounds mild until you realize the prisoners had only thin striped uniforms and worked 12-hour shifts without adequate breaks. At first, there were no barracks. The prisoners slept in the tunnels themselves, on the bare rock or on thin straw mattresses crawling with lice. There were no proper sanitation facilities, just a few buckets for hundreds of men. Disease spread rapidly in these conditions. Dysentery. Work was brutal beyond description. Using hand tools, pickaxes, and primitive drilling equipment, the prisoners carved out the mountain. They hauled rocks, poured concrete, laid rail tracks, and installed machinery. Guards from the SS beat anyone who slowed down. Those who couldn't work were sent back to Buchenwald or to the execution chambers of nearby camps. Life and Death, underground Jean-Michel, a French resistance fighter who survived Mittelwerk, later wrote about the experience. We lived like moles, never seeing the sun, never breathing fresh air. The mountain became our entire world, a world of stone. Shifts were organized around the clock. As one group of prisoners stumbled out of the tunnels, another stumbled in. The sound never stopped. Hammers striking stone, machinery grinding, guards shouting, and underneath it all, the groaning and coughing of men dying on their feet. Food was barely sufficient to sustain life. A typical daily ration consisted of thin soup made from potato peelings, a few ounces of bread, and occasionally a bit of margarine or sausage. Men who arrived healthy were reduced to walking skeletons within weeks. The death rate during the construction phase was astronomical. Some estimates suggest that one prisoner died for every 4 V2. Gods ruled through terror. Random beatings were common. Prisoners could be hanged for the slightest infraction, stealing food, sabotaging production by working too slowly, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Public executions were used to maintain discipline. The bodies were displayed as warnings before being taken away for disposal. Yet even in these conditions, resistance existed. Some prisoners engaged in subtle sabotage, misaligning components or using incorrect measurements. Others maintained their humanity through small acts of kindness, sharing food, supporting the sick, or simply remembering each other's names. These acts of resistance were dangerous, but the rocket that would change warfare. The V2 rocket was a marvel of engineering. Standing 46 feet tall and weighing over 27,000 pounds when fueled, it was the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. Powered by liquid oxygen and ethanol, it could reach a speed of 3,500 miles per hour and an altitude of over 50 miles before descending on its target with a 1-ton warhead. From a technical standpoint, the V2 represented a quantum leap in weapons technology. It incorporated advanced gyroscopic guidance systems, sophisticated fuel pumps, and innovative aerodynamic designs. After the war, both the United States and Soviet Union would base their early space programs on captured V2 technology. But producing these complex machines in the depths of a mountain, using slave labor, simply in the darkness. By early 1944, the construction phase was complete enough to begin production. The main tunnels had been transformed into assembly lines. In Tunnel A, V2 rockets took shape station by station, moving along rails as different components were added. Tunnel B focused on the production of V1 flying bombs, another terror weapon, though simpler in design than the V2. The production process was divided into numerous stages. At one end of the tunnel, workers assembled the rocket's tail section, including the complex engine components. The fuel tanks were welded together in another area. The guidance systems, built to precise specifications, were installed in specialized clean rooms. Anomalous pocket workers, both slave laborers and German civilians, performed the most delicate tasks. The German technicians were often conflicted. Some believed in the cause and worked enthusiastically. Others were simply trying to avoid being sent to the Eastern Front, where death was almost certain. They worked alongside prisoners who had every reason to sabotage their efforts. Quality control was a constant challenge. The V2 was an extraordinarily complex machine, and even small errors could cause catastrophic failures. Many rockets exploded on launch pads or shortly after liftoff. Some estimates suggest that more people died building V2 rockets than were. Human cost of innovation. Yves Bon, another French survivor, described the production process. "We were building rockets that would kill civilians in London and Antwerp, and we were doing it under conditions that killed us. Every rocket that went out of that mountain was stained with the blood of prisoners who died creating it." The irony was not lost on the prisoners. They were forced to create weapons of terror while themselves being terrorized. Some found grim satisfaction when they learned of V2 failures, knowing their subtle sabotage. By the end of the war, Mittelwerk had produced approximately 6,000 V2 rockets. Each one represented countless hours of forced labor, performed in darkness and misery. The facility also produced components for V1 flying bombs and other weapons projects. The German engineers and scientists who worked at Mittelwerk, including Werner von Braun, were later asked about their knowledge of the working conditions. Most claimed ignorance or minimized their involvement. This was disingenuous at best. The conditions were impossible to miss. Von Braun himself visited Mittelwerk multiple times and would have seen the prisoners in their striped uniforms, emaciated and dying. After the war, von Braun and hundreds of other German scientists were brought to the United States in Operation Paperclip, where they became the foundation of America's rocket program. The prisoners who built the weapon, Mittelbau, the concentration camp. As Mittelwerk grew, it became clear that housing thousands of prisoners in the tunnels was inefficient and dangerous. In the fall of 1943, a concentration camp was established near the tunnel entrances. Originally a subcamp of Buchenwald, it was designated Dora Mittelbau in 1944 and became an independent camp. Dora was built specifically to service Mittelwerk. The barracks were hastily constructed wooden buildings, overcrowded and poorly heated. Conditions were marginally better than living in the tunnels, but only marginally. Prisoners still worked 12-hour shifts, received starvation rations, and faced constant violence from guards. The camp eventually held over 60,000 prisoners over its operational life. More than 20,000 died there from starvation, disease, exhaustion, and execution. Bodies were cremated. Mittelbau became part of a larger network of concentration and labor camps scattered across Germany, all dedicated to underground production. The system was designed to be self-sustaining. As prisoners died, they were replaced by new arrivals from other camps or from occupied territories. Other underground cities. Mittelwerk was the largest and most famous, but it was not alone. Across Germany and occupied Europe, the Nazis initiated dozens of underground construction projects, creating what has been called the Ries in Lower Silesia, modern-day Poland, was perhaps the most ambitious after Mittelwerk. Here, in the Harz Mountains, the Nazis began construction of an enormous underground complex. The exact purpose has never been fully determined. Some believe it was intended as a command center for Hitler, others that it was to be an underground factory or weapons research facility. The construction of Project Ries involved 7 separate tunnel systems, with over 200,000 square feet of underground space planned. Thousands of prisoners labored under appalling conditions. Unlike Mittelwerk, Project Ries was never completed. The advancing Soviet army forced its abandonment in 1945, and much of Ebensee in Austria was another major underground facility. Built into the side of a mountain near a picturesque lake, it was designed to produce components for jets and rockets. The tunnels at Ebensee were dug through solid rock by prisoners from the Mauthausen concentration camp system. Conditions were so harsh that the death rate was among the highest of any labor camp in the system. Kaufering, near Landsberg in Bavaria, was actually a network of 11 subcamps. Prisoners here worked on underground bunker systems and armaments production. The Kaufering camps were characterized by especially primitive living. Conditions many prisoners lived in underground. Strategic philosophy. The proliferation of underground facilities reflected a strategic shift in Nazi Germany's war planning. Unable to win the war through conventional means, the regime invested enormous resources in weapons programs that, they hoped, would provide a technological breakthrough. The underground factories were meant to be invulnerable. As long as they could produce V2 rockets, jet aircraft, and other advanced weapons, Germany might still turn the war around. This was, of course, a delusion. The Allies' material superiority was overwhelming, and no amount of advanced weapons could compensate for Germany's shrinking. But the strategic thinking reveals something important about totalitarian systems. Their willingness to sacrifice people on an industrial scale in pursuit of goals that are ultimately unachievable. The underground city project consumed resources that might have been used for rational defense, or even for negotiating a less catastrophic end to the war. Instead, those resources, including human lives, were buried in hell. For the prisoners of Mittelwerk and Dora, each day followed a brutal routine. Awakening came before dawn with shouts and blows from guards. Roll call, or appel, took place in the freezing darkness, often lasting hours. Prisoners had to stand at attention while guards counted and recounted, looking for any excuse to inflict punishment. After roll call came the march to the tunnels. Prisoners walked in columns, 5 abreast, under guard. Those too weak to keep up were beaten or shot. At the tunnel entrance, the columns split, each work commando heading to its assigned station. Inside the mountain, the work began. For those on excavation duty, it meant hours of swinging pickaxes against stone, breathing dust, hauling rocks. For those on the assembly, performing repetitive tasks with numb fingers, mistakes were punished. Slowing down was punished. Sometimes, simply existing was enough to draw a guard's wrath. A midday break brought thin soup and a piece of bread if you were lucky. Many prisoners never received their full rations. Guards and capos, prisoner functionaries, stole what they wanted. The strong took from the weak. Survival meant calculating every calorie. The afternoon shift was even worse than the morning. Exhaustion set in. Injuries mounted. The death count rose. Some prisoners simply collapsed and died where they fell. Others were carried out on stretchers, never to return. Evening brought the march back to camp, another roll call, and in the distribution of evening rations more soup, a bit more sleep. But sleep in the overcrowded barracks was hardly restful. Men coughed through the night. The smell of unwashed bodies, excrement, and death was inescapable. Some men died in their sleep. Their bodies were discovered at the next morning's roll call. Survival strategies. Despite the inhuman conditions, some prisoners survived through intelligence, luck, and mutual support. Those with useful skills, electricians, mechanics, engineers, were more valuable and sometimes received better treatment. Speaking German was an advantage. Having a friend or relative in the same camp increased the odds of survival. Some prisoners became capos, taking on supervisory roles in exchange for better food and treatment. This was a morally complex choice. Capos were expected to maintain distance. Some capos were brutal. Others used their positions to help their fellow prisoners when possible. Prisoners also formed small networks of support. Sharing food, even a tiny morsel, could mean the difference between life and death. Experienced prisoners taught newcomers how to survive, how to avoid the worst guards, how to look busy without exhausting yourself, how to organize, steal extra food or clothing. There were even moments of humanity. Secret religious services whispered in the darkness. Shared memories of life before the war. Poems scratched into stone. These acts of resistance against dehumanization, psychology of survival. Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist who survived Auschwitz and other camps, wrote about the psychological aspects of survival in his book, Man's Search for Meaning. While he didn't experience Mittelwerk specifically, his observations apply to all concentration camp prisoners. Frankl noted that those who survived often had some meaning or purpose that sustained them, a loved one they hoped to see again, a task they wanted to complete, a witness they needed to bear. Prisoners who lost all hope, who could see no future beyond the camp, often died within weeks. At Mittelwerk, some prisoners found purpose in small. If they could slow production or damage a rocket component, they were striking back at their oppressors. Others focused on survival itself as an act of resistance. Living despite everything was a victory. The SS tried to destroy not just the bodies, but also the spirits of their prisoners. They succeeded in many cases. But the survivors bore witness, ensuring that the world would know what happened in the mountain. Chapter 6. The end approaches. The war closes. By late 1944, the strategic situation for Germany was hopeless. The Soviet army was advancing from the east, having liberated Poland and reached Germany's. Forces had broken out of Normandy and were pushing toward the Rhine. Germany's cities were being reduced to rubble by round-the-clock bombing. Yet V2 production at Mittelwerk continued and even accelerated. In some months, the facility produced over 600 rockets. They were launched primarily at London and Antwerp, causing significant civilian casualties, but having no strategic effect on the war's outcome. The human cost of this production continued to mount. New prisoners arrived to replace those who died. Conditions, if anything, deteriorated further as German infrastructure collapsed and marches and evacuations. In early April 1945, with American forces approaching the Harz region, orders came to evacuate Dora Mittelbau. The SS, determined to leave no witnesses, began organizing death marches, forced evacuations of prisoners on foot toward other camps deeper in Germany or Austria. These marches were genocidal in intent. Prisoners who couldn't keep up were shot. Others died of exhaustion, starvation, or exposure. Thousands died during the evacuations from Dora and its subcamps. Some prisoners were loaded into cattle cars and transported by rail. One particularly horrific incident occurred in early April when a transport train was bombed by Allied aircraft near Gardelegen. The SS herded the survivors into a barn, locked the doors, and set it on fire. Not all prisoners were evacuated. Some were hidden in the tunnels. Others, too sick to move, were left behind. The SS planned to destroy the entire facility and seal the tunnels, entombing everyone inside. Fortunately, the speed of the American advance prevented this final atrocity. Liberation. On April 11, 1945, units of the U.S. 10th Infantry Division reached Nordhausen. What they found shocked even hardened combat veterans. The town itself was devastated. Ironically, it had been bombed heavily by Allied aircraft just days before, causing thousands of civilian casualties. But the real horror was in camp barracks. American soldiers found hundreds of corpses and dying prisoners. The SS had fled, but they'd left behind those too weak to evacuate. Some were barely clinging to life. Many died in the hours after liberation, their bodies too damaged to recover even with medical care. Over the following days, the Americans explored Mittelwerk itself. They walked through the vast tunnels, seeing the assembly lines, the rail tracks, the machinery, and the scattered evidence of the human suffering that had made it all possible. Among the liberating soldiers was Charles Paine, whose great-nephew would later become President of the United States. Like many who saw these camps, he rarely spoke about it in later life. The American military government took control of the facility. Engineers examined the rocket production equipment with fascination and horror. Intelligence officers documented everything, preparing reports that would be used in war crimes trial. Camp barracks, American soldiers found hundreds of corpses and dying prisoners. The SS had fled, but they'd left behind those too weak to evacuate. Some were barely clinging to life. Many died in the hours after liberation, their bodies too damaged to recover even with medical care. Over the following days, the Americans explored Mittelwerk itself. They walked through the vast tunnels, seeing the assembly lines, the rail tracks, the machinery, and the scattered evidence of the human suffering that had made it all possible. Among the liberating soldiers was Charles Paine, whose great-nephew would later become President of the United States. Like many who saw these camps, he rarely spoke about it in later life. The experience of justice and injustice. In the immediate aftermath of liberation, the Allies focused on caring for survivors and documenting what had happened. Many former prisoners were too weak to travel and remained in displaced persons camps for months. In subsequent years, some of those responsible for Mittelwerk faced justice. The Dora-Mittelbau concentration camp trials, held in 1947 as part of the broader Nuremberg process, prosecuted 19 defendants, including several camp commandants and administrators. 15 were convicted, 4 received death sentences. However, many others escaped justice entirely. Hans Kammler, the SS general who appeared in the war's final days. His fate remains uncertain. Reports suggest suicide, others that he was killed by the SS to prevent his capture, and some conspiracy theories even claim he was secretly taken to the United States. Most controversially, the scientists and engineers who designed the V2 and oversaw its production were not prosecuted. Instead, they became valuable assets in the emerging Cold War. Operation Paperclip. Before the Soviets could reach the Harz region, American intelligence agents dismantled Mittelwerk. They seized documents, equipment, and completed rockets, transporting them back to the United States. More important, Herr von Braun and over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians were brought to America under Operation Paperclip. Their Nazi Party memberships and knowledge of slave labor conditions were downplayed or erased from official records. Von Braun became the face of America's space program. He appeared on television with Walt Disney, charming audiences with visions of space exploration. He led the team that developed the Saturn V rocket, which carried Apollo astronauts to the moon. He died in 1977, honored and celebrated. The prisoners who built the V2 rockets, whose forced labor made von Braun's designs a reality, were rarely mentioned in these celebrations. Their suffering was an inconvenient truth in Soviet exploitation. The Soviets, arriving in the region shortly after the Americans, found the factory largely stripped. But they too seized what they could and recruited German scientists who hadn't gone west. The Soviet space program, like the American one, was built on V2 technology and German expertise. In a strange historical irony, the Cold War space race, often portrayed as a contest between democracy and communism, was made possible by weapons developed through slave labor in Nazi Germany. Both superpowers built their rockets on the graves of remembrance and memorial. For decades after the war, Mittelwerk and Dora-Mittelbau were largely forgotten. The site fell into the Soviet zone and later East Germany. Access was restricted. Survivors scattered across the world, many reluctant to speak about their experiences. In 1966, the East German government established a memorial at the site of Dora Mittelbau. However, it emphasized the resistance of communist prisoners and downplayed other aspects of the camp's history, including the fate of Jewish prisoners. After German reunification in 1990, the memorial was redesigned to more comprehensive. Today, the Mittelbau Dora Memorial is an important site of historical education. Visitors can tour portions of the tunnels, see exhibits about the V2 program and the prisoners who built the rockets, and pay respects at the memorial sites. The memorial serves an essential function, ensuring that the world remembers not just the technological achievement of the V2, but the human cost of that achievement. Students visit from around the world. Survivors and their families return to bear witness. The tunnels today. Large sections of the Mittelwerk tunnels remain sealed. Some areas are structurally unstable. Others are contaminated with chemicals. In the 1990s, there were proposals to completely seal the complex, but preservationists argued for maintaining access to key sections for historical purposes. Walking through the open sections today is an eerie experience. The tunnels are cold and silent. Rails still run through some sections. You can see where assembly stations once stood. Graffiti from both prisoners and post-war visitors covers some waltz messages in multiple languages, names, dates, cries of pain and defiance echoing across decades. The mountain keeps its secrets. It's estimated that tens of thousands of prisoners passed through Mittelwerk and Dora. The exact death toll will never be known. Bodies were cremated, buried in mass graves, or died on evacuation. Banality of evil. Hannah Arendt, covering the trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1961, coined the phrase, the banality of evil. She observed that Eichmann was not a fanatic or a sadist, but a bureaucrat who organized genocide with the same mindset as someone organizing a transportation schedule. This concept applies directly to Mittelwerk. The German engineers who designed the production systems weren't all ideological Nazis. Many were simply doing their jobs, solving interesting technical problems. The fact that their solutions involved working prisoners to death was, from their perspective, someone else's concern. This is perhaps the most disturbing lesson of Mittelwerk, that ordinary people, pursuing ordinary goals within a corrupt system, can participate in extraordinary evil without technology and morality. The V2 rocket represents a profound moral paradox. It was a technological marvel, a genuine achievement in engineering and physics. The same basic design principles that powered the V2 later powered the rockets that put humans on the moon, launched satellites, and explored the solar system. Yet this technology was born in darkness, built through suffering, and used to kill civilians. Can we separate the achievement from its context? Should we? Wernher von Braun certainly thought so. He saw himself as a rocket scientist, not as a war criminal. The slave was necessary for advancing rocket technology. This rationalization is common among scientists and engineers who work on military projects. We're just solving technical problems. How our work is used is not our responsibility. But this rationalization falls apart at Mittelwerk. Von Braun visited the tunnels. He saw the prisoners. He knew the conditions. He continued his work. The V2 was not a neutral technology that happened to be misused. It was specifically designed as a terror weapon, and its production was inseparable from systematic murder. Historical memory. How societies remember events like Mittelwerk reveals much about their values. In post-war America, the focus was on V2 was displayed in museums as a wonder of engineering. Von Braun was celebrated. The prisoners who built the rockets were footnotes, if they were mentioned at all. This is slowly changing. Modern exhibits and documentaries increasingly emphasize the human cost. The U.S. Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama built on the site where von Braun's team worked, now includes information about Mittelwerk and the slave laborers. But the tension remains. How do we acknowledge achievement while also acknowledging atrocity? How do we honor technological progress while remembering the victims of that progress? There are no easy answers. Perhaps the best we can do is insist V2 was a remarkable rocket. It was also an instrument of terror, built by slaves who were worked to death. Both things are true. Both things matter. The Underground Reich Mittelwerk was part of what some historians call the Underground Reich, the Nazi regime's attempt to create a hidden infrastructure that could continue the war even as the surface world burned. This project failed, as it had to. The idea that Germany could turn the war around through superweapons was always fantasy. By the time Mittelwerk reached full production, Germany lacked the fuel to launch many rockets, the industrial capacity to support its armies, and the manpower to defend its territory. The underground factories were impressive, but they couldn't change. The Underground Reich remains significant because it shows how totalitarian regimes respond to impending defeat. Rather than seeking rational solutions or surrendering to minimize suffering, they pursue increasingly desperate and destructive paths. Resources that could have been used to protect civilians or negotiate peace were instead buried in mountains, along with tens of thousands of prisoners. Epilogue. Echoes in the stone. In the end, Mittelwerk and the other underground facilities were monuments to a particular kind of evil, bureaucratic, industrial, systematic. They represented the Nazi regime's attempt to make genocide and warfare efficient, to rationalize the irrational. Prisoners who suffered and died in these tunnels were not random victims. They were selected by an ideology that deemed them subhuman and destroyed by a system that valued rockets more than human lives. Their deaths were not incidental to the project, they were an integral part of it. When we marvel at the Saturn V rocket or celebrate the Apollo program, we are indirectly celebrating the legacy of Mittelwerk. This is an uncomfortable truth, but it's important. Progress and atrocity are not always separate. Sometimes they're intertwined in ways that resist easy moral judgments. The tunnels remain in the mountain, slowly deteriorating. Perhaps one day they'll collapse completely. The memorial remains. The testimony of survivors remains. The historical record remains. And we who come after have a responsibility to remember not just the technological achievement, but the human cost. Not just the rockets that reached the sky, but the prisoners who died in the darkness beneath the earth. The Kohnstein mountains stand silent now. Inside, in the darkness, you can almost hear the echoes, the sound of hammers on stone, the cry of dying men, the rumble of rockets being moved toward launch sites. These are the sounds of history, and we ignore them at our peril. For in those tunnels, in that darkness, humanity encountered itself. And what it found was both its greatest ingenuity and its deepest shame, forever entangled, forever inseparable. Memory of the more than 60,000 prisoners who passed through Dora Mittelbau and Mittelwerk, of whom at least 20,000 died. May their suffering never be forgotten, and may their stories serve as a warning to future generations.